Good morning. Welcome to session 4. I would like to first introduce the chair of this session, Dr. William Ma, who is assistant professor of Asian art history in the School of Art at Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge. He is a specialist of late imperial Chinese art and its interactions with the world, with an emphasis on vernacular, ornamentation, and material culture. With Diana Greenwald, he is a co-curator of an upcoming exhibition about seeing Chinatowns at the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C. For this past few years, he has been expanding his research area to Vietnam, specifically the artistic exchanges between Imperial China, colonial France, and Ran Vietnam. So welcome, Dr. William Ma.
Thank you so much and good morning. I want to first just express my gratitude for Todd, Hua, and Montana State University for inviting me here. I also want to thank the Museum of the Rockies for hosting us, and of course, Terra Foundation for the generosity for funding all of this proceeding. What I'm going to present is actually really a series of, or a collection of discovery and connections that I noticed doing my research on other projects. So hopefully this is somewhat coherent. And the conclusion won't also be sort of incredibly sort of deep, but I would love to hear your ideas, comments, and thoughts on this topic. So let's start. For collectors, connoisseurs, and scholars of Chinese art history, there's a clear separation between Chinese works of art made for the export market and the ones that are made for domestic consumption. While they do at times overlap, for most part, their differences are reflected in how they were received by their different audience and the technique. Sorry, I should actually be here for now. The audience and the techniques such as material, style of painting, subjects, composition, etc. But recent scholarship have always also demonstrated that often close relationship that blur these categories. Artists, motifs, and materials move back and forth between the Chinese court and the treaty ports. And artisans and art workers freely move in various workshops and studios, sometimes within the same sort of environment. Before the middle of the 19th century, foreign traders were only allowed in certain parts outside of the city gate in Guangzhou. There, traders from various European countries and the newly formed United States were able to purchase objects made by mostly local artisans specifically for them in shops such as this. There's a detail of a larger photo. Catering to their unique taste for exoticism and naturalism, and also imbued with local Cantonese characteristics. On the other hand, local workshops and artisans also make works intended for the domestic markets at different levels. In the famous porcelain capital of Jingdezhen, workshops under the direction of appointed officials made porcelain specifically intended for the imperial court. The same artists would also produce versions of these works for a local audience back home. In this brief talk, I want to further contribute to this perspective through the lens of another avenue that further blur these categories, works found in overseas Chinese communities. Specifically, I want to focus the examples from overseas Chinese temples in North America, since these treasured objects often survive with their provenance and context. Though mostly drawn from California from the second half of the 19th century and really into the early part of the 20th century, I will bring examples from overseas Chinese temple in Southeast Asia as well, arguing that the interaction we can observe in North America were part of a larger global story of Chinese art history. For many Chinese sojourners to the United States, homesickness was a constant. The sentiment was frequently expressed in a poem incised onto the walls of the barrack on Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, where they were forced to be confined before being admitted into the country. I'm sure many of you know about this poem, so I certainly won't pretend that I'm an expert on this, but I want to sort of open with this. One writes, I left the native village wall behind me, bid farewell to my father and mother. Now I gaze at distant clouds and mountains, tears forming like pearls. The wandering son longed to be wealthy like Tao Tzu. Who would have been known that I would be imprisoned on island? I beat my breast when I think of China and cry bitterly like Ren Qi. Our country's wealth is being drained by foreigners, causing us to suffer national humiliations. My fellow countrymen have foresight, plan to be resolute, and vow to conquer the US and avenge previous wrongs. One could spend another 20 minutes or more unpacking the context and meaning behind this poem about a new national self and desire for individual fulfillment that nonetheless remain anonymous. But I want to highlight the writer's the writer's desire to show off his erudite background through references to classical exemplars. This and some of the poems were written in a beautiful standard script and carved onto the wooden panels. And despite the attempt to literally whitewash them, retain the rectitude and strength of the character, both of the text and of the writer. For the two were linked through the practice of calligraphy historically in China. The incise text further call back to the literati practices familiar to detainees back at home, especially the educated one, often found on institutional facade of religious, secular, moral, or cultural authority. And here I purposely chosen two sites. Both are in Guangdong within a sort of short distance of where these detainees would have come from. More than merely preserving the text, the carved text was a way for the writers to visibly demonstrate their frustrations and longing through classically latent poetic expressions, and at times distinguish themselves from the lesser educated fellow detainees. It was also an act of self-affirmation by tightly holding onto an august Chinese cultural past, manifested as a nationalistic fervor in the face of discrimination and oppression. I opened the presentation with this example because the subsequent examples I will show are inextricably connected to the issue of how sojourners saw themselves as learned, as wealthy, as successful, as Cantonese, and as Chinese, and manifesting these identities through a reconstruction of a familiar environment to an audience who would understand the specificities of the messages. Through these examples, Chinese men had a tangible link to their homeland, no longer reachable and fading fast in their memories, and rapidly being replaced by other forms of newfound identities. Whether acquired directly or indirectly through middlemen, these objects provided access and confirmed memberships to networks and communities in China, in the United States, and in the spiritual realm. Far away from the extended families, clans, and ancestors, these objects remind and demonstrate that they were still part of them. Sites of encounters are important. By the second half of the 19th century, southern port cities like Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and Macau were hubs for foreigners, especially after they were forcibly opened after the treaty signed as a result of the two Opium Wars. The same spaces were also transit points and nodes for connecting overseas Chinese with their families in Siyi. People, goods, and monies were exchanged in these cities, floating both to overseas and back to ancestral homes. This addresses the audience for export art included both foreign visitors and transient Chinese with ties to overseas. Through the works of Chiu Mei Ho and Bennett Bronson, we know many gilded carvings found in Chinese temples and shrines in North America originated in Guangzhou or Hong Kong. This is just a screenshot of the website that I think is somewhat, has not been updated for a while. I know they have plans to update this. This is also in their book as well. But it is incredibly useful sort of resource. Many of these sort of gilded carvings are clearly labeled, such as this example from the Temple of Five Gods from San Jose, which is now a museum. You can kind of see on the left the label of Shengcheng and Yuedong, which is actually standing in for Guangzhou or Canton. Well, the gilded carvings provide an indisputable link between the overseas Chinese community with the metropole and rural China. Figures found in temples and shrines further reveal links between the vernacular and export. Red face, bulging eyes, and raised golden applique. These characteristics were not unique to Cantonese deities, certainly, but they were clear local and vernacular expressions. The same characteristics are found on a statue from the Berlin's Ethnographic Museum collection with a label identifying him as the German Lutheran missionary and translator Klaus Gustloff. Putting Gustloff side by side with the Weaverville deity, they suggest a similar geographic and temporal origin. Like so many foreigners throughout the 19th century, Gustloff was active in Guangzhou, Macau, and Hong Kong. These were the same places where many of the objects commissioned or ordered by overseas Chinese community originated. In these cities, it has been the common view that Cantonese artists made works to accommodate the taste of the foreign customers by adhering to Europeans' perspective, decorating colorful ceramics and cloisonnés, and replicating their own image of Westerners. Top hat, wigs, and jacket with a row of buttons running down the front. Characteristics observed in Gustloff and in these pairs of candlesticks, pewter candlesticks in an antique shop in Mobile, Alabama. These stereotypes of the foreigner was based partly on existing depictions of Europeans. Confined to factories outside of the city, foreigners in Guangzhou commissioned portraits such as the one on the right, starting in the 18th century, and continue into the 19th century. Recent scholars such as Roberta Wu, Winnie Wang, Lai Yuzhi have discussed the striking verisimilitude of these figures, a quality also observed in other genres of Chinese export art, such as botanical paintings. Chinese figures done using similar methods were sold for foreigners in Guangzhou. Famously, this well-documented couple brought back from Guangzhou to Salem, Massachusetts by the American captain, Richard Wheatland. Though separated by more than half a century, these figures share much resemblance to operatic figures from Chinese temples like Oroville and Marysville. While the export portraits were made by clay or wood, these figures were made with more fragile material like paper or fabric. Speaking on the rooftop glazed earthenware Shiwan figures on Cantonese Temple, the anthropologist Marianne Wong from the City University of Hong Kong emphasized the ritual function of these operatic figures as perpetually performing for the gods. Other figures made in a similar manner, but also with material, such as painted paper mache, were also seen in Cantonese temples during the same time period as part of New Year celebration. Due to the ephemeral quality of the constructed material, these figures often do not survive. We were allowed access during the visit earlier this year. We were allowed access to the collection in Oroville, Chinese Temple, and we were able to see some of these. We did not take them out because they were incredibly fragile, languishing in these sort of wooden trunks. Yet, in these fragmentary states, we have a chance to see how they were constructed, and also make comparison of their construction to 18th century export portrait figures, like the one on the right in David Clark's book. Another commonly found export art object in Chinese temple is reverse glass painting. At the Weaverville Chinese Temple, 3 reverse glass paintings are on the altar table. Two depict the three sort of star gods, Fu, Lu, and Shou, standing in for prosperity, fortune, and longevity. On the right is a depiction of a banquet scene celebrating the birthday of legendary Tang Dynasty General Guo Ziyi. Again, these are fairly standard sort of type of representations that you find in many type of vernacular sort of decorations. The two paintings for the gods share a basic composition with many examples of export art, suggesting the prevalence of works like this as a commercial and modular production. Works like this as a commercial sort of object made under sort of modular mass production. Perhaps operating in a workshop mode like export painting workshop common in Guangzhou. Here's a detail from a famous painting supposedly by Ting Hua showing the interior of one such a painting workshop. Scholars like Jessica Patterson have also demonstrated that these types of reverse glass paintings were popularly exported not only across the Pacific, but throughout Southeast Asia, in places with a significant Chinese population, such as Thailand and Vietnam. Speaking of Vietnam, recently I've been doing research on a Vietnamese temple in a colonial park in the suburbs of Paris, eastern suburb of Paris. Now at the Musée Rabelais, the so-called Fu Dog, so very much closely resemble lions from Shiwan, a kiln in the town of Foshan just west of Guangzhou. I was initially puzzled by the question of how a Chinese object would show up on a structure, on a building, erected by Vietnamese artisans for a French colonial exposition to commemorate Vietnamese who died for France in World War I. Long story short, I was able to discover a group of Cantonese artisans living and working in Chok Lok, Chulong, or the Vietnamese version of Chinatown in Saigon during the 19th and 20th century. In addition to supplying local Cantonese buildings such as this, decorated with glazed earthenware figures found on the ridge of so many Cantonese temple roofs, they also supply Vietnamese structures. The Chinese immigrant artisans were not shy about their place of origin, proudly labeling their work with their workshop names and their own town of Shiwan on the right for people who can read Chinese. From everyday ware such as green jars preserving vegetable for preserved vegetable to brownish alcoholic bottles to colorful temple decorations, Shiwan glazed earthenwares were incredibly popular as export and as domestic ware, catering to Chinese and non-Chinese clients. But for the Cantonese immigrants, they were significant because they were something familiar, ubiquitous, and homely. Shiwan figures do appear in North American temples, but most of them have been lost, replaced, or removed. At Bok Kai Temple in Marysville, two Shiwan figures once stood on the two roof corners. They have since disappeared and replaced with two wooden substitutes. Based on this photograph, at least one was half of the He immortals, often translated as two harmony boys, bringing blessing and financial gains to visitors to the temple. A contemporaneous example from Shiwan on the left will give you a sense what it may have looked like. While I was not able to locate Shiwan lions in situ, lions like this one are hidden in various historical collections, waiting to be discovered. The Shiwan lion here was donated to the museum by descendants of a local Cantonese immigrant. Shiwan objects then provide a material link not only to China, but to other Chinese diasporic community in Southeast Asia and beyond. Since this paper is really a collection of objects and discovery I had in archives and museum storage room while doing research for other projects, instead of a clear conclusion, I want to offer a few thoughts and observations. First, I think it is clear that at this point in the field of Chinese art history, we can no longer draw clear boundaries between the different genres of art or even audience in late imperial China, as Clay Kunis has suggested in his Mellon Lectures and eventual book. Instead, we need to expect a fluidity of both audience and identity of the makers. People, things, ideas, and objects move. That should be a given. Texts should not be taken at face value, and they need to be interrogated. The Vietnamese Shuan figures are a perfect example. Here, the label of Shuan does not denote a place of origin, at least not for the objects themselves, but as an identity for a group of artisans living and working far away from Shuan. It points to the land of the artisans' ancestors, where they belong to a community of the living and the dead. Finally, it functions as a brand, a guarantee of quality and artistry. It is perhaps for these reasons we should think about the audience for both export and domestic vernacular art. What did foreigners trading and working in Canton, far away from their ancestral homeland in America and Europe, had in common with overseas Chinese toiling in a strange land? And how did these objects speak to them? Certainly, the message and meanings would be very different, though they were being purchased in the same urban environment in Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and Macau. Yet uniting them would be a sense of homesickness and a need to negotiate between exoticism that they encounter and a sense of belonging they desperately wanted to create. A souvenir, as Susan Stewart writes, both offers a measurement for the normal and authenticates the experience of the viewer. For foreigners and Chinese sojourners, these objects tangibly link them back to China, indexical to their connection and memories there, to a place and time no longer repeatable, but continue to live on in the narrative generated by these things. Thank you.